Okay, guys, 5 minutes to the show, but I want to tell you something. So I received a call from a reporter asking about Aaron, and they're asking the right question, actually, because they were mentioning the government falling in Italy last year, and Aaron was there. I was also here, so I can prove for that. And also the Swedish government is falling, and Aaron was there. He was in Malmo, though, not in Stockholm, so we can try to keep this thing.
Did you speak with them? And did you tell them that I was only in Malmo?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry to jump in and interrupt or whatever, but I mean, this is about me, so I think that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
I got you covered.
Okay, everybody, here's the thing. It's ridiculous. Obviously, committee, we are a communications agency. We make some content. We, occasionally we write jokes. We put on that fashion show the one time. We certainly aren't engaging in any kind of subterfuge or anything untoward with the government. Okay, I think that's number one. Number two, I think the Stockholm alibi is going to work. I think that's great. That's, of course, where the center of government is, et cetera, et cetera. Here's the thing. I was actually in Stockholm. In fact, I was there exactly when the government did fall. But now that you've told a reporter I wasn't, that's no longer the truth. And so in the interest of the truth, I think we should maintain the idea that I was not in Stockholm last week. I think that's fine. And I think that just prevents confusion around the truth. It's not altering the truth in any way. It's just explaining it with a story that I think will be helpful for everyone. So if we can all keep together on the Stockholm alibi, I would appreciate it. The company would appreciate it. And I think it'll be better for the show. So now that I've told you that we're all kind of in this together, sorry.
La imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida, sacrificarse hasta la muerte en los campos de batalla de todos los continentes del mundo.
Live from Berlin, it's the Committee Program, the chronicle of the world's most mysterious global political strategic communications entity. On today's show, Monday, June the 28th, Ellie Mae O'Hagan, Ninon Lagarde, Emily Kenway, Fulvio Venanzetti from the Italian Pensioners Union, and featuring Deputy Director of the show, our own Julia Doubleday, and the rest of the committee gang. And now, a man who very much wants you to know that asinine coincidences do not equal causation or guilt in any jurisdiction anywhere, and are not even particularly interesting to talk about, Arun Chaudhary.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for joining us. Jacopo, look, when we're doing messaging, when I'm using you for messaging on the show, in this case to protect, our new clients in Sweden, you've got to believe it first. You got to spend time believing it before you project it to the audience. It's sort of like oxygen on the airplane. You're going to want to take it in first before you give it to the audience, who are the kids riding alongside us. All right? So I just want want you to figure that out. Just because, this is important stuff. We can't have misinformation flowing from the show. YouTube, as you know, is the wellspring from which almost all misinformation springs.
But you were in Sweden, right?
Yeah, no, I was in Sweden. Of course I was in Sweden, and of course the government fell, and, this is an unfortunate coincidence. You know what? Let's do an explainer on it very quickly. I'm just learning, so everyone can correct me in the comments where I get it wrong, but of course, we're trying to get up to speed in our Sweden in a real way, the way we are in our Netherlands and our Kosovo and our Italy and other places that committee works so hard. Okay, so put 60 seconds on the board. Count it down for me.
Ok, allora, 3, 2, 1, vai.
Okay, here's what you got to know about Sweden, and I'm of course just getting up to speed as I'm just started working there, and so you all keep me honest in the comments. But the hilarious thing are the names. So the big players way up here are the Social Democrats. That's not the hilarious name. That's exactly who you think it is. These are the people who Bernie Sanders admires so much. They're the architects of the Swedish model, and they have really, put together a welcoming, refugee-loving welfare state in Sweden. Then you also have the moderate party, who are not moderate, but are in fact the far-right party. You have the Swedish Democrats, who are not the Social Democrats, but share initials with it. You have the left party, who I think a lot of us sympathize with, just want things bigger, better, faster, more when it comes to progressive issues. And then you have a smattering of, Green parties, liberals, a center party, etc. What you had happen here, which had absolutely nothing to do with me, was, oh my God, I have 5 seconds left, was the government fell because the left party wanted something that then all the other conservative parties jumped on cynically, destroying the majority. First time it happened in 57 years, and they have to have snap elections now. We think, unless they form a new majority. That was pretty good.
No, yeah,
it was more of an
good.
introduction to the parties, I think, than it ended up being exactly on the moment that we lived in. But that's good. That's good. We need to do another one. And, Forrest was working on, for the Global News Rodeo, a bit about Ethiopia. So let's actually find out. I'm not sure if he's at school right now, but let's get him in here to explain Ethiopia, because actually the situation is a little crazy. And although people, this is Wednesday. I'm just going to, I'm going to ruin the fourth wall here. Things may happen between now and then. I think everyone will benefit from a quick Forrest 60-second explainer on this. Let's get him in.
Okay. Hi, Forrest.
I'm glad you were available. This is good. We're scheduling these things. We're doing better. We're doing better all the time. So can we do a 60-second things with you on Ethiopia?
Absolutely.
Okay. Let's get 60 seconds on the board.
All right. 60 seconds for Forrest. And here we go. 3, 2, 1, bye.
The long-delayed general elections in Ethiopia took place last Monday. Votes are still being tallied in the 6 participating regions, with final results expected in 2 weeks. The elections come at a volatile time in the second most populous African nation. Current Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's newly formed party, the Prosperity Party, is said to be leading in most polls. Abiy rose to power in 2018 and is characterized as a reformer by his supporters. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019 for his attempts to democratize the country. But despite the efforts, 4 of the 10 regions were unable to cast ballots due to ethnic violence and oppositional boycotts. Additionally, the northern region of Tigray is rife with a bloody war that has stretched on for months and caused a brutal famine affecting more than 350,000 people. And Wednesday, today, saw an airstrike kill dozens at a market in the region. A new government is unlikely to form until all 10 regions, including Tigray, can rightfully vote. Election board officials fear these incomplete results will jeopardize the credibility of their fragile democratic process.
I didn't time it. How did we do? It was too long, right?
No, that was 60 seconds. Perfect.
Wow!
Hey!
Excellent. Nice one, man.
Thanks. I even added about the airstrike, and it still works.
Yeah. No. I mean, look, news is gonna like we told folks, news is gonna continue to unfold on this, and it's obviously a pretty crazy situation. And I think you'll probably hear more about it in the Global News Rodeo. But that was great. We all did great, and I think we put a little distance between us and this Sweden story. And I think we can move on to Cross Atlantic Crosstalk. Hi, welcome to Cross Atlantic Crosstalk. With us, as always, is Ellie Mae O'Hagan, the director of Class think tank, and of course the show's own Julia Doubleday, who is just returning from a road trip, and so we'll have a lot to say about the America that we all love. And then we'll be joined at the end by Ninon Lagarde, who is in France and who is going to give us an update on the French elections and who is working for the Progressive Primary. She's actually the communications director. But let us start in America, which either we're at the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning, or whatever Churchillian thing you want to say about the infrastructure bill. We have a bipartisan bill. I'm about to show a clip of Joe Biden surrounded by the least interesting people in the world. And either that's good because this sort of sidecar spending deal that's part of this 4-dimensional Democratic plan. So they spend $1 trillion. All right, let me break it down, especially for Ellie. Have you heard anything about this? So we've gone down from needing $10 trillion on infrastructure to spending $1 trillion in infrastructure, except the deal says that then everyone's also going to pass these other things that have a lot of additional spending on it. So they've reached a bipartisan deal instead of going only Democrats, and it's for a sort of less ambitious project with a legislative plan to get the rest through. Julia, I mean, what do you think? What do you think? Are we wielding power? Is this good, or is this sort of like where the Joe Biden progressive plan fizzles?
Yeah, so essentially the bipartisan bill could pass, but Congress is not going to pass it unless they can also get through their budget reconciliation plan, which will include additional spending, and there's no indication that that can actually get through. So we're sort of at a standstill, actually. So for all the fanfare about like reaching a compromise, I appreciate that Pelosi and Schumer are saying they're not going to pass the $1 trillion compromise bipartisan infrastructure bill without this other bill, because it is a little bit of playing hardball, like more than we're used to seeing from them. But at the end of the day, it's all sort of just showmanship and playing games if they're not willing to abolish the filibuster. So, I mean, without abolishing
let me
the
show the
filibuster,
clip. This seems like a show that Joe Biden enjoys playing. The kind of like, we're back message in Europe is now like Congress is back. Like, we're back to doing things together again. Isn't this great? Let me see if this clip thing works. We have the technology.
Come on up. We had a really good meeting, and to answer your direct question, we have a deal. And I think it's really important. We've all agreed that none of us got all that we wanted. I clearly didn't get all I wanted. They gave more than I think maybe they were inclined to give in the first place. But this reminds me of the days we used to get an awful lot done up in the United States Congress. We actually worked with one another. We had bipartisan deals. Bipartisan deals mean compromise. One of the things that I've made clear, I've signed on, and I'm going to let them give you the detail and you can ask them, and I will talk to you all later, next hour or two, but I promise you I'm not going away. But one of the things that we agreed on infrastructure, we made serious compromises on both ends. There is, and they'll give you the numbers.
So it is a little squishy around the edges, other than the bipartisan happy feeling of being together.
I mean, I just saw a lot of really old white people, is what I
did say
saw.
the most
And when we
uninteresting
talk
people
about-
in the world, yeah.
Joe Biden
when we
is so old. It's
I let that
crazy.
clip go on for a bit
that.
also because I did think it was important to sort of, this is the tone and tenor of the conversation.
He's 20 years
Yeah.
older than Boris Johnson. I mean, Boris Johnson is like, I would take Joe Biden any day of the week over Boris Johnson, don't get me wrong, but...
And
20
post-COVID,
years,
Boris
that's-
Johnson is a hollow shell of a man, as far as I can
Yeah,
tell.
yeah, totally. He's probably aged about 20 years in the last year. But yes, it's crazy.
So
the
it is,
gerontocracy
and
of the
the
Democrats.
oldness and the whiteness and the we're getting back to somethingness, I guess, is sort of the trifecta of worry.
Yeah, just that there's this idea that it's unfair to get rid of the filibuster, but there's no sense that it's unfair to deprive people of medical care or proper wages for their work or any of these other things that they're claiming that they fight for. It's this tiered system of fairness and rightness and justice where upper class people and privileged people have certain things, there's certain boundaries and rules about the way that you talk to them and the way that you treat them that just don't apply to the whole entire rest of the population that you're supposed to be representing. So I think that what they're bragging about here is not the bill itself. It's literally just the idea that they're willing to give away things that they wanted.
Totally,
They're
right?
excited
Like
about
that's the point of it. It was like, yeah, it felt good. It was like exercise, right? Like I dug deep and it felt good and it was painful.
I think when we talk about this concept of compromise in democracy, we also need to acknowledge the oligarchical control of our democracy. So in other words, it isn't actually true that compromising means that different groups of people have different interests, and now we've come together and we've found a solution that works for everyone. That's how it would work in a real democracy, where the representatives in our government actually were representing the people that they were elected to represent. Instead, what we have is this big money, corporate controlled system whereby most of the people in office don't represent anybody except their corporate donors and a small group of billionaires and special interest groups. So when we talk about compromising, what we're talking about is compromising the interests of the vast majority of American people with the interest of health insurance, or the interests of a vast majority of the public with the interests of oil companies. So it's not two conflicting groups of just ordinary American citizens that are meeting together and finding a solution. It's one group of people that are trying to advocate for what regular Americans need, compromising with corporate actors who are trying to exploit and take what we need.
And this is exacerbated by having, the two-party system for sure. And I guess, Ellie, with what Julia is saying, like, do you feel like there is more incentive baked into the British system to have, to polarize or to come together or to compromise in this way that Julia is describing, which is, a lowest common denominator journey and not actually charting a correct best path?
The current iteration of the Labour Party fetishizes compromising in the same way that the Democrats do, and it's because, for all the reasons you described, Julia, is basically the same. And I think it's also this idea that politics isn't about a conflict of interests, and actually we're sort of living in a world that's beyond politics, where everyone can win. That was sort of something that was, created in the 90s by the Democrats and by New Labour. And
echoed in the West Wing to continue a conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. 2 weeks ago, yeah.
Fucking West Wing. Am I allowed to swear that the blinking West Wing? And it's like, and now the sort of that sort of faction of the Democrats are now back in control of or maybe they never left, and they're certainly back in control of the Labour Party. So I think like compromise has sort of got symbolic value in that what it suggests is that actually there's no conflict of material interest here, that we can actually just work this out together and meet all of our interests. The Tories are the complete opposite. So instead of compromising, they have selected a small group of voters that they know will always turn out for them, which is sort of older white retirees who are sort of quite a resentful group of people, it seems. And they constantly sort of confect these conflicts in society in order to make those people feel threatened and resentful, and then kind of attract them to the Tories. So the latest one that you probably read about this week was that the government released a report saying that white children don't do well in schools because woke people talk too much about white privilege. So it's those kind of conflicts that they are sort of inventing in order to create like the opposite of compromise, so that they can agitate this particular group of voters that they know will be particularly resentful and will kind of come over to them. So it really depends on which party you're talking about. One
and this is a global
like
phenomenon. The right is really good at sort of telling an anecdotal story that takes you down that path in a sort of illogical way to get to the conclusion
that's really well said,
need.
Ellie. And certainly, like in the U.S., the right, when they're in power, they don't fetishize compromise, and they don't talk all day long about how they need to work with Chuck Schumer. It's going to be the end of the world. No, it's just smash and grab as much power as they can.
We are joined now by Ninon Lagarde. Thank you for coming onto the show, onto the committee program. We are going to be relying on you to explain after the regional elections in France, what's next. But first, all of us, let us watch Michael Walker explain in a really good way, I think, for our international audience, something that's been going on in another one of our favorite subjects. And I tried not to talk about it last week, and Ellie brought him up. So I will blame her for last week. But we're going to talk about Sir Keir Starmer, because when one person leaves, that's one thing. When two people leave, when three top people leave, it's like it's going to be a conversation on the show. So let us listen to Michael explain.
The ongoing clear-out of Keir Starmer's top team has claimed its latest victim. Starmer's political director, Jenny Chapman, has been forced from her job amid increasing disquiet from Labour MPs. Now, Chapman's departure follows that of Ben Nunn. He was Director of Communications, and Morgan McSweeney, who was his Chief of Staff. So that's three of the top jobs in Lotto, so leader of the opposition's office, have now gone. As to what forced Chapman out, Henry Zeffman in The Times has some well-informed analysis. He writes that after Labour's defeat last month in the Hartlepool by-election, Chapman came in for much of the blame. She was accused of choosing a Remainer candidate with a questionable social media history, opting to hold the contest on the wrong date, and botching the reshuffle that followed, inflaming Starmer's relationship with Angela Rayner, his deputy.
That is such a nice list of things to have been written up that it's definitely like, again, I got to witness this working on the UK election 2019. It's definitely people just leaking directly. That was just a quote that somebody wrote for that person. But can you tell us, like, what is happening? There's another election coming up. Like, Keir just seems to be digging deeper and deeper into a ditch. Is this a ripping off the Band-Aid moment, or is this just sort of panic before the fire at the disco?
So what I heard is that he was planning on getting rid of all of these people. So basically there's a by-election coming up. It's the Batley and Spend by-election. You will know that constituency as Americans and beyond, because it was the constituency that Jo Cox ran before she was assassinated by a far-right terrorist. Yeah. And then it was taken over by a woman that I like a lot called Tracy Brabin, who then became the mayor for North Yorkshire, West Yorkshire, somewhere in Yorkshire. Sorry, Tracy, I can't remember off the top of my head which part of Yorkshire. But that then meant that she had to resign being an MP, and so then there came a by-election, and now Jo Cox's sister, Kim Leadbetter, or Kim Leadbeater, I'm not sure how you pronounce her surname, she's now the candidate, the Labour candidate. And the important bit of background for this is that it's really rare for the opposition to lose by-elections. Usually the government loses by-elections because it's sort of seen as a way of like kicking the government, but without like having to change the government. Jeremy Corbyn lost one by-election in Copeland, and it was considered to be a resigning matter. I mean, he never resigned because that's
right. It was like, oh my, the horror. Yeah.
So this will be Keir's the third by-election that Labour's lost, but the second one
third that I'm counting.
Yeah, but the second one where they held the seat. So that we had the Chesham and Amersham, I think that was it. Yeah, the Amersham by-election last week, where Labour got like.
You could probably be making that up, and you could say all of us. We would be like,
Bumbleberry,
okay, that sounds about right.
And and like Labour got like 3 figures, so like 600 and something votes. And like, I mean, they weren't going to win in that constituency anyway.
When you know everybody, it's not good.
Yeah, exactly. But it was still like their worst result, I think, since 1935 in that constituency. So that was pretty bad. They said the reason for that was tactical voting, that people voted to get the Tories out. I have no idea whether that's true. And then so if they lose Batley and Spend, that will be like pretty historic string of losses for them. And so there is a lot of pressure on Keir Starmer to sort of at least shake things up. And I heard that he was planning on doing this big shake-up of his top team after the by-election, if in the event that Labour loses, but that it leaked, so he's been forced to do it all now. I have no idea whether that's true, but it does make some kind of sense, because I don't really understand why he would lose so many people right before the by-election, because it makes it harder to not take the blame yourself if you're getting rid of everybody that like could take the blame for you.
Yeah. We wouldn't recommend it as campaigners.
Yeah. So I'm not really sure what's happening there, but it's definitely like safe to say that I mean, already there's a lot of pressure on Keir Starmer because his polling is pretty bad. Like Labour is in a worse shape now than it was like in Labour's worst months under Jeremy Corbyn.
But there's no pressure because there's nobody else, right? I mean, will we see something like an equivalent to in the PD in Italy? We just saw Letta get kind of recalled from Paris, former prime minister, former leader of the party, kind of. All of a sudden, everyone goes to the old faces. Like, will we see like some sort of Ed Miliband like comeback?
No. So I think basically what will happen is the Labour right are looking for an opportunity to change the rules about how Labour runs its internal elections, and if they can do that, then they will stitch the leadership election up so that they can make sure that the members have less influence, and that means that there's much less likelihood of a left-wing candidate being able to be elected. And so I think then you'd get somebody from the Labour right, so that the names I've heard, Yvette Cooper, Rachel Reeves, and it was Wes Streeting until he became very unwell, so now he's no longer in the running. These are the people that I think you might see sort of taking over from Keir Starmer
so the pendulum goes fully
if the right gets its way, if it's not able to change the rules, then you know, it would be much less likely because the membership is far to the left of the PLP, that's the Labour MPs. So if the membership were still able to sort of have the most influence over who wins, then it blows it all a bit more wide open. And I think if you're wondering why Keir Starmer hasn't yet been overthrown, I think that is your answer, is because at the moment, if he was overthrown, he would probably be replaced by somebody to his left, and they want to stop that at all costs.
Keep him propped up. This is going to be a heroic transition I'm about to make. But we actually, I think something that would really influence that will be turnout, and we actually have seen a flurry of elections around with comparatively low turnout after we had election, including the American election, with comparatively high, both at regionals in Italy and in America. Turnout was pretty good. We just saw the regionals in France, turnout was extremely poor, and this maybe even distorted results. Ninon, we're going to look at a quick explainer in a minute, but I just wanted to introduce you first because we talked about the progressive primary with Clement on the show a few weeks ago, and you were the communications director of this effort. And so I'm hoping that you can specifically tell us, number one, about, because American audiences, obviously, we get fed a steady Le Pen diet when it comes to the French election, right? It's like, is she a better campaigner this time than she was last time? She seems to always lose. Will she not lose this time? Kind of Lucy in the football coverage. So I do, I think you can be helpful in putting a point on that. But also, what does the progressive landscape look like? Who should we be rooting for? What should we be rooting for? Especially since you're not affiliated with any of the candidates, I feel like you could help us. But especially, again, for our audience who might not know much, we are going to look at a clip. Also, Nomiki told us if we put clips in, it helps the YouTube algorithm. We have yet to test if that's true, but, we try.
But it was very interesting. The last large election before the presidential election in less than a year. So it was really an opportunity to take really the temperature in the country and see the big trends ahead of this crucial election next year. And while Marine Le Pen's far-right party, the Rassemblement National, was polling and doing really well in this election and gaining some momentum and legitimacy before this crucial race, they actually did much worse than expected. That was really the surprise of the night. While they came ahead in 6 regions in the last regional election, 2015, they came ahead only in one region this time around. That was in the Provence-Alpes-Côte d'Azur region. Even there, it's unknown for now whether they can win in the second round of the election next week. And they've lost ground in most regions there. So it was really a setback for Marine Le Pen's party. That was really the big surprise of the night. Another surprise was that the centre-right party held pretty well, and a few contenders for the centre-right, potentially for the presidential election.
So actually mirroring what happened in Saxony-Anhalt, the far right did worse and kind of gave a boost to the regular old center right, who none of us are a huge fan of to begin with. But tell us about the landscape. Tell us how much we should have been surprised by Le Pen's party's performance. Tell us about it.
Hey, thanks for having me. First, let's not overread the election of last week. So tomorrow is the last day of the regional election, and we will have much more to learn from. But let's not overread it. I'm not fully agreeing with what the journalist said previously, because no one showed up to this election, so it's super hard to read. And first, the fact that no one showed up isn't a surprise, even though the French media can't stop telling things about how it's a huge mistake. Nobody show, we know it's been 20 years that no one show up to every election, and especially young people don't show up to election, and each year it's getting stronger and stronger. So it's not a huge shock. And the fact that Marine Le Pen voters didn't show up to the poll and show up to the vote isn't that much of a surprise, because it's a bit like the same for Emmanuel Macron. People vote for him, just like people vote for Marine Le Pen. But when it's someone else on the list, even though they put their faces on the tracks and everything for the campaign, it doesn't work that way. And people want to vote for them, and if they're not the candidate, they won't. So that's not a huge shock. And we know that it shouldn't be a relief too for the presidential election that the Front National voter didn't show up, because they will show up for the presidential election. So let's not be happy about it.
So do you think, in general, that the polls that were showing Marine Le Pen gaining strength are similar to the old ones we've seen, where she does gain strength and then she campaigns and it's not that great and it comes down to earth? Or do you think this time there actually is enough trajectory for her potentially to take off?
Well, she didn't probably start a campaign for 2022, so it's hard to read. Like, for example, Mélenchon started his campaign 6 months ago, and we can already see who's in the campaign or not, and how how things are working. For Marine Le Pen, it's hard to see. She's not in a in a really good shape, and things are not working for now, but we're still super scared, and we know that she has some money to fund her campaign, and people are angrier and angrier, and people that don't vote for this election will vote for her for the presidential election. So, yeah, it's not a good news for now.
And on the progressive side, tell us who you see, and I definitely want to open it up also for Julia and Ellie to take advantage of. You're spending some time with us.
So, in the progressive side, for the regional election, what we can see and what we will learn tomorrow is that union of the different progressive party is working, and we can win with that. So that's something that we will hope be a reality tomorrow, and that's something that we count on for the presidential election. Right now, there is too many candidates on the progressive side in order to just think about going to the second turn of the presidential election. So the organization I'm working with is trying, with the Primaire Populaire that you've heard about last week with Clément, to bring all those people who have so much in common around one candidate. So we first worked on the ideas, and now making sure that everybody gather around this idea and make sure we have only one candidate for this election. In France, for the regional election, some lists were a union of the Green and the left and the far left, and some of them were disconnected, and this week they had to work in order to form union or not. And depending on each region is different. So each region is like a test for 2022, which is interesting, but also tiring, because we know that it works when people unite themselves and make one list. So we'll see tomorrow.
Anyone jump in who wants to jump in? Okay. Are you guys going to actually make like a physical sort of manifesto object that is something that people sign onto? Or like, when you say sort of the common ground, how are you going to specifically define what the common ground is and communicate that through the candidates and also yourselves to the public?
Actually, we already did that. It's been 6 months that we are working with each party on the progressive side. We have a
that sounds
gathering.
Like a nightmare.
Yeah, it is. It is like a couple therapy, basically, but with 16 different participants. So it's hard, and we've been working with them, and they have so much in common regarding the idea and all those propositions. We've worked with the political party, but also with the civil society proposition, because there is so much group, like I'm not sure if you've heard about it, but the Citizen Convention that wrote proposition from citizens on how to tackle climate change, other NGOs that are working on different topics. We merge everything, the political ideas and the citizen ideas, into propositions that are on our website, and there is a petition there where you can sign and say, hey, those ideas are great and I want only one person to carry them for the presidential election. Please, political party, please merge and participate to this primary election in order to find the perfect candidate. But it's first the idea, then the candidate, which is something really new, and we hope that citizens will find it fresh and want to join, and it's not like political nightmare where everybody is trying to find his way to the presidential seat. I hope I answered your question properly and it makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, and knowing kind of how, is this in the press, is this treated, how is this treated in the press? Let me not influence you anyway.
Yeah.
For those of us who are not following the French papers the way that we should be.
It's always hard for the press to follow citizen initiative like ours and like other, because in the journalist redaction there is always one journalist for the right, one for the left, and one on the left side is in a is having great contact with all the political party, but not with the civil society. And we are not from the political party, we are civil society. So they don't know how to properly treat us and how to say if we are strong enough and if we are a serious initiative or not. So it's badly treated right now, our initiative, but the more we gain a signature and the more people are following what we do, the more the media follow us. And we organize meetings with all the candidates from Mélenchon to Jadot to Anne Hidalgo, and to make sure they have discussion, and that is something we will be able to do after the regional election, because for now, for some of them, they are in a competition. So it's hard for them to ask them to be friends and to merge and to discuss for the presidential election if they are in campaign with each other.
Yeah, it's hard enough in one party. I mean, I think all of us can tell you, working in contentious center-left elections in the US and UK, that's definitely the case.
Yeah, but there are parties that are in bad shape, so I hope we will make them work with us, because they have no choice, basically.
That is true. Necessity is sometimes a good motivator. And thank you so much for telling us about it. I hope we can catch up with you later, even as the elections come closer. And maybe even have you on very briefly to do a thing about how the elections that are going to happen this weekend end up going. This will be broadcast the day after, so we'll all be embarrassed to not know. So there's a lot of incentive. I'm incentivizing you now.
Yeah, I would love
to come back on the show and tell us what happens. Great. Julia, thank you as always. Ellie, good to see you. Next segment.
La imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida.
Just waiting for it. Here we go. Welcome to your Global News Rodeo, our roundup of global events as curated by the show's own Forrest, Lovette. Item 1, turmoil in Tigray. Ethiopian airstrikes hit market. Deutsche Welle reports of a deadly airstrike at the market in Ethiopian village of Tugoga. The bombing was in the war-torn region of Tigray and is said to have killed at least 40 people and injured dozens more. The conflict is between Ethiopian government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or the TPLF. Tigray was one of 4 regions that were unable to take place in the general elections last week due to ongoing violence. Incumbent Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's regime said the attack did not injure any civilians and it was a precision strike against the TPLF. But witnesses say otherwise, and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission is investigating. I think this is a nice addition to Forrest's already informative 60 seconds that we got. Again, be careful what you get your news from. Let's all be careful. There's always been a lot of misinformation, both in the Ethiopian conflict specifically. Item number 2, bittersweet symphony. No confidence vote in Sweden. Teshigau reports that the Prime Minister of Sweden, Stefan Löfven, lost a vote of no confidence in Parliament last Monday. The vote came in after a rift between Löfven and his party, the Social Democrats, and allies in the Left Party over housing and rental policies. Out of the 349 members of Parliament, 180 voted against Löfven, parties on the opposite ends of the spectrum voting against him, the right wing, the middle, and the left. The PM now faces a choice either to hold snap elections or resign. It is the first time in Swedish history that prime minister has been voted out of office in this manner. Yeah, there's not. Maybe I was there, maybe I wasn't. Nobody knows. Item number 3, nowhere to go. Thousands to place in Myanmar. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OSHA, says around 230,000 people have been displaced due to violence in Myanmar. Channel News Asia is reporting that the OCHA has attempted relief efforts to little success due to armed resistance and insecurity. The unrest has been continuous since the February coup toppled the government and caused mass protests and deadly clashes between the ruling military regime and civilian militias. The UN continues to seek additional aid to help with the crisis. Item number 4, corruption carnival. Brazil official resigns. Al Jazeera is reporting a Brazilian environmental minister, Ricardo Salles, has resigned over an inquiry into illegal logging. Salles was the center of a criminal investigation into whether he obstructed the police in their probe of illegal logging in the Amazon rainforest. The disgraced minister was already facing global backlash after recording of a cabinet meeting revealed that he had proposed for Brazil to ignore environmental regulation during the pandemic. Deforestation in the country has increased 85% under President Bolsonaro's administration. Item 5, La Resistance. Thousands in French unite against the far right. The Socialist Worker reports that tens of thousands of organizers filled the streets of Paris in opposition to the growing far-right fascist support in the country. A reported 140 demonstrations were held, which included over 150,000 people, according to the organizers. The rallies were coordinated by parties on the left, as well as trade unions, environmental groups, LGBTQIA, and anti-fascist groups. The growing dissent comes as the far-right presidential candidate, Marine Le Pen, is gaining in polls, and current President Emmanuel Macron's party has moved even further to the right. Participants said an anti-fascist movement in France is needed urgently. And actually, I think it's especially needed talking to our guest and Cross-Atlantic Crosstalk, because it's funny, in Italy, I feel like I'm always the one who's sounding the alarm, and it's like, no, Salvini's real, Meloni's real, these people are coming. But then in France, I'm one of the people who's like, she probably won't win, because, constantly it's like just push that she might win, and then it never even comes close. She seemed worried. She seemed genuine about it, and I think that behooves us to take it as seriously as she does. Item 6, say what? Eric Adams, the face of the new Democratic Party. Politico reports the New York City Democratic primary for mayor was won by Eric Adams, a retired police officer of 22 years. Adams ran on a campaign of decreasing gun violence. In contrast to progressive and second-place candidate Maya Wiley, Adams is against police reform and likened last summer's nationwide protest of the George Floyd murder to throwing a Molotov cocktail. An emboldened Adams said on Thursday he was the face of the new Democratic Party. Adams went on to say, "Look at me and you're seeing the future of the Democratic Party. If the Democratic Party fails to recognize what we did here in New York, they're going to have a problem in the midterm elections, and they're going to have a problem in the presidential election." I disagree. I actually think the people who decided not to vote Democrat on law and order issues, it's not really on law and order issues. We know that crime is, a much bigger perceived problem than it ends up actually being. And the police are a much more minimized problem than they actually end up being. And so some very, very serious reform is needed. And all you're doing is losing progressive allies by trying to sort of navigate this new third way that Mayor-elect Adams is talking about. And I think the thing I want to say is that people don't want the new face of the Democratic Party or the new face of the Republican Party to be about these things that they don't care about. They want it to be about who they can trust to do sustainable development and to bring jobs that are good jobs, and they're willing to tolerate on the right a certain amount of racism, and they're willing to tolerate on the left a certain amount of liberal, whatever you want to call it-ism. But that's not why they're pulling the vote. It's not why they're pulling the lever. That's all I have to say about that. 4-hour meeting. How about a 4-hour presentation? I do 4-hour
It
presentation.
should be illegal again. Like, I don't have that much concentration span.
There ought to be laws. There ought to be a goddamn law.
After 30 minutes.
Okay, so the one thing that I did want to say, and all that was good. We'll use all of that. You know, it's all good. Hi, and welcome back to the committee program. I am your host, Arun Chaudhary, and now we have Deep Cuts. We're going to take a deep dive on the conception and misconceptions around modern slavery in a segment set up by the show's own Julia Doubleday. Julia, what is in store?
Thanks, Arun. Yeah, so today we have joining us Emily Kenway. She's a writer, activist, and former policy advisor. She's also the author of the book, The Truth About Modern Slavery. She's joining us today to help us take a critical eye to the entire concept of modern slavery as a framing with the potential to obscure the reality that worker exploitation and abuse is a feature, not a bug, of our modern economy. Drawing on her extensive work in the field, Emily makes the case that while UK conservatives vocally condemn modern slavery and politicians across the spectrum refer to it as an apolitical issue, they continue to advocate policies that lead to harm, vulnerability, and exploitation among workers generally, and in particular, migrants, sex workers, and workers in corporate supply chains. So thank you so much for your book and for being here today, Emily.
Thank you very much for having me.
So why don't you start us off by telling us a little bit about your background and your work in this field?
Yeah, so I've spent many years working on social justice campaigns in a variety of capacities, and I was doing a lot of work on workers' rights issues back around the time that the UK got the idea for a law on modern slavery, which partly came from California, where there's an act that requires large companies to make a disclosure about their supply chains and exploitation in their supply chains. And at that time, I didn't really put two and two together about how this modern slavery phrase that was coming to us from kind of American academics and big corporates was actually operating in a really problematic political way to separate out kind of endemic exploitation from this other thing that they'd decided they were going to have a crusade against. So I spent many years working on this in different ways, working with frontline organisations, working with migrant domestic working women, and also as an advisor to the UK's first independent anti-slavery commissioner, which is a role appointed by the government, and then subsequently NGOs, as I decided to become more and more outspoken.
Can you tell us a little bit more about this framing of modern slavery as in the book you talk about a contaminant versus a continuum? So in other words, framing it as something that's external to the system as opposed to something that's built into the economy as it is today.
Yes. So I was very familiar with the work of George Lakoff, the cognitive linguist, and ideas around framing as being very important for our conceptions of problems and what we think the solutions are. And I took that over to this topic. And essentially, what I demonstrate in the book is that we call exploitation, severe forms of it now, modern slavery, right? And that's a choice about words. And of course, words aren't just words. They're also all sorts of connotations, inferences. They bring to mind lots of things. And when we say modern slavery, we're evoking historical slavery, so images of manacles, extreme bad treatment, but also certain other things. So we're conjuring in our mind something that apparently we eradicated in the first half of the 19th century, in the UK anyway, without addressing any of the political or economic structures that were there. So we managed to just pick it up and take it out of our political economy. There we go, nice and done. And the same mindset comes with us into this modern slavery idea, where it's like we can just raid and rescue, extricate the bad thing, wipe away the contaminant, done and dusted. Related to that, you very much see that historical slavery is raised in speeches, in documents, everything around modern slavery and human trafficking, often to do this kind of crusading language and to portray the issue as something that everyone is on the same side against, right? There's no one walking around, certainly willing to say publicly as a politician that they wish historical slavery had continued, right? We're all against it and we all agree it's immoral. And therefore, the same must be true for this thing we're calling modern slavery. So exactly as you said, Julia, it's portraying it as something that's not political. It's not about a political issue. And we actually, I show in some speeches and media articles and stuff, you'll actually see that written down, like this is not about politics. Of course, it's entirely political because what we're talking about is people seeking livelihoods, people seeking safe migration pathways. You know, in the UK, care kids who've been in the care sector, brought up in care, going into drug running, or obviously women who don't have access to other forms of money going to the sex industry and so on. So you can't escape the politics of it, but that's what this idea constructs. And that's why it's both powerful and really frightening.
And really insidious, right? Because it sort of takes people who have perpetrated the slave trade, you know, the colonizer states especially, and is giving them the power to use this communications weapon as a blunt instrument against the developing world in many cases.
And that is so true, especially for corporate supply chains as well. So you'll see, it used to be a lot of my job to deal with large companies around this topic, and they'll have, you know, drinks receptions. These are major corporations that you'd be familiar with over there as well. Drinks receptions, shiny brochures about all the things they're doing to tackle modern slavery, when actually the way that they're running their supply chains, the prices that they're willing to pay to the factories in Bangladesh or wherever are so low with such fast turnaround times, they are embedding those very things.
Yes, yeah. Actually, I found that super interesting, the way you talked about how corporate actors, brands, basically get to cast themselves as the heroes of the story, that they're the ones that are investigating. They're the ones that are investigating the suppliers and making sure that there's no malfeasance and no exploitation. But at the same time, they're pressing down on their suppliers, on the manufacturers, giving them these impossible goals to meet with an impossible budget. So sort of baking that in. So there were three things I think that you talked really in depth about, three sectors of workers that are uber exploited. One is people in these complex corporate supply chains. And then you also talked about sex workers and migrants. So to start off a little bit more on the migrant immigration front, I'd love if you could speak a little bit to, you know, you talked really compellingly about this case where dozens of Vietnamese migrants were found dead in a shipping container. Yeah. And immediately once this happened, the press was calling you up and asking you about human trafficking. And you were sort of confused about this because there's a difference between migration and trafficking. So tell us about, you know, how did the press treat that case and how do they treat it differently than cases where people were found alive?
Yeah, so it's a really kind of perfect and tragic example of how this frame, this narrative, this story about exploitation operates. So in October 2019, 39 Vietnamese people were found dead in a lorry in an area of the UK called Essex, which is kind of fairly near the coast. They would obviously have been driven in. And the first thing I knew about it, as you say, was telephone calls coming to me from producers and journalists asking for comment on it. Or, you know, the news kind of went wild about it because for us, that's an enormous loss of life. And it was very shocking. And I was completely bemused because, definitionally, all they could have possibly known was the case at that point was that it was migrant smuggling, probably based on ethnicity, based on, obviously, people don't really hang out in the backs of lorries if they are able to travel safely. So they would probably have crossed the border illegally. That is technically migrant smuggling. Whereas human trafficking in the US as well as the UK, you'd need to have evidence of exploitation. So those people were being exploited. And obviously you can't tell that if you've got people who've passed away in a lorry. You don't know what's been happening or is about to happen to them. And I realized why this was happening, why I was getting these phone calls quite quickly, because the politician in the area, the local politician, and also our Home Secretary, had immediately started describing it as a case of trafficking. And the press were taking that lead. Now, obviously, for the press, trafficking is a kind of sexy sensationalist topic, so they will often want to run with that. But I could really see that the politicians were pointing in that direction for a very specific reason, which is that when we imagine trafficking as the general public, we have in our mind a kind of abduction scenario, kidnapping, and what the problem we think about is the baddie that's done that. It's this individual villain. You might be familiar with the film Taken, the movie Taken.
Totally.
Yeah,
that's exactly, I think, what everyone was thinking of immediately.
So that's what people have in their mind. In reality, the majority of trafficking in the world is not because of that. Of course, it happens occasionally because there's always exceptions to the rule for everything. But most trafficking happens because it's basically migration gone wrong, like someone can't get the opportunity, get the safety that they would have wanted to have, and they fall into the wrong part of the economy. So when we are being told by politicians, you should think about this huge loss of life as trafficking, what we're really being told is you should blame the men, basically, who did this, have that idea of that villain in your mind, rather than the alternative, which is the border, right? Why do people get into a lorry in order to make a better life? And actually, since it sort of all went to court and stuff, it wasn't a case of human trafficking at all. It was a case of smuggling, like I had suspected at the start. And indeed, the fathers of one of the young people who passed away said he was just trying to get to a better life and earn money for his family back home. So it really was that kind of a case. And the way that we can see that what I'm saying is like definitely correct is that a month later, in exactly the same part of the UK, a lorry was stopped. 10 men were found in the back of that lorry. Thankfully, they were alive, but they were struggling to breathe. And they were immediately arrested for immigration offences and described in the press as suspected migrants, which is this weird phrase that started happening over here in the last 3 to 5 years, which, you know, someone's a suspected migrant, like you might be a suspected thief or something. And so you can see that disparity. Well, they're dead, so we're going to say it's trafficking and we're going to feel bad for them. They're alive, so we're going to say it's smuggling and we're going to criminalise them. And it's that clear.
In terms of casting, you know, you very clearly show how our villains are being cast in this frame. And now how about our heroes? It sounds like a corporate responsibility, CSR units of, you know, big corporations are sort of writing this playbook. Who are they picking to be the heroes of the story?
Well, they pick themselves, you know. Like really what we see is the kind of the big cheese CEOs who are setting up like award ceremonies and sitting on panels for things or giving some funding to hotlines, this kind of thing. And of course you also do get some, it's particularly bad in the US, I'd say. Thankfully we slightly have a less of a problem with it over here, but faith-based NGOs that purport to be rescuing people, particularly in the global south, who get a lot of money, and periodically there are amazing exposés of what they're actually doing. There's one called Exodus Cry that I really recommend Googling and just being appalled at what you find. But they very much are this like, we're ex-law enforcement, we go in, we raid, we rescue, without understanding the context, without listening to the people.
They sound like mercenaries.
It's really frightening, actually. It is really frightening.
Let's talk a little bit more about this concept of rescue as well as the concept of victimhood here. So one thing, you know, we notice in this narrative, again, there's a clear-cut hero, there's a clear-cut villain, there's a clear-cut victim. And the way, as you were saying, sort of contrasting migrants versus trafficking victims, you know, it's similar in the sex work industry where the way victims are framed is that they were kidnapped and they've been forced into sex work against their will, whereas in quite a lot of cases, the reality is these are women who maybe wanted to participate in sex work, but then were exploited. And that complexity is totally erased from this narrative. So what does it look like when sex workers or migrants are quote unquote rescued in the UK from these situations? You know, we're basically led to believe that it's just sort of this happily ever after ending and then they go on to have a happy life. But what actually happens after
so rescue is one of the kind of core components of the fairy tale of modern slavery, right? So you've got your baddie, you've got your heroes, and then you're rescuing people. And in reality, that's just not what's happening at all. Of course, there are situations which people want to be removed from. However, in the UK, they're often not removed into a better situation, because what you have to understand is that this is a problem of the economy and of immigration policy, basically. And those things don't change. When we take someone out of one situation, okay, so they're no longer with that employer who is behaving in a way that doesn't meet our laws, but they don't have a better option suddenly. So with migrants, specifically with undocumented migrants, so people who don't have a legal right to be in the UK, that we don't give them the right to be here once they've been confirmed to be victims of trafficking. There is that's not a kind of right we afford to them, even though we know they've been exploited in our country. We provide them with some very low level amount of money a week while their case is looked at, and then once that's dealt with, they're free to go back into the informal economy where they're hiding from the immigration authorities. They might do an asylum claim, which takes years here, or they might be deported back to where they were originally trafficked from, which is obviously not ideal. We have a lot of victims of trafficking in immigration centres in the UK, so like immigration jails for undocumented people, which has only been exposed relatively recently. And it comes down to this thing of essentially that people who are leading this crusade and people who are in positions of power making policy have kind of privileged lives with salaries, and they could choose to do different jobs if they wanted to. They're not living in the part of the economy where your best offer is a bad offer, and that's really the problem. That means we can't possibly be rescuing people. With regard to the sex industry, and I can say more if you want about kind of trying to understand how trafficking fits into the sex industry, because it's a kind of contentious topic. But certainly there is a massive, massive problem with trafficking and modern slavery being used, allegedly trying to tackle those things being used against sex workers. So, for example, raids being done in brothels that purport to be anti-trafficking raids and that are actually just trying to shut the brothels down. So to give you an actual example, I give quite a lot of actual examples of that in the book that have been proven. But we hosted the Olympics here in 2012, and always around big sports events, there's this myth that you get a lot more trafficking for sexual exploitation, and it is a myth. When academics have researched it, it is a myth, but it always happens that myth happens. And so the Mayor of London gave £500,000 to our London police force to do extra policing on the sex industry to try to find trafficking in the run-up to the Olympics. And a police officer has actually said they use that money just to shut down brothels under the kind of rhetoric of trafficking, right? So you're just taking away marginalised women's livelihood because you feel like it. And that is an enormous problem. Often what we see with rescue in the sex industry is someone having their livelihood taken away who is choosing to do it, potentially because they don't have very many options, but it's still the choice that they're making.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, and if you want to elaborate more, speak more to the sex work industry, please.
Yeah, so I think there's a really useful way of thinking about the sex industry in relation to this topic that often somehow gets missed because we end up in this kind of fog of, well, it's sex work and I don't know, some of it's probably bad and like moral stuff and all of these worries. If we think instead that the sex industry operates in the same way as all other work industries, right? By which I mean there's a continuum of conditions that people are working under. So there are the best possible conditions for that industry. We might not like what the industry is, maybe, you know, there are a lot of really crap industries, but the best possible conditions. We might find that in New Zealand, for example, where they've had a sex worker win an employment tribunal against their brothel manager for harassment, for example. So best possible conditions through a kind of downward slope of worse and worse conditions. And that's where you might find people who were choosing to be in the sex industry, but now they're being paid way less than they were promised, or they're being told they have to work overtime or provide services they didn't want to. Things that you would also see in other sectors through that continuum. And then at the very far end, the worst possible conditions, which is where you will find real trafficking cases, which we can call rape, because obviously if people aren't choosing to have that sex, that's called rape, and rape is already illegal. Like, you know, it's already something we don't agree with. And it's the same as in, for example, domestic work. If someone was being kept in a house and forced to work there, we'd call that forced labour. So you've got the same continuum in all sectors. And when you think about the sex industry like that, it really helps to go, okay, so yeah, there are some instances of trafficking. There's a lot more that's kind of problematic conditions and very little that's good conditions. So how do we address the real part of the problem while maintaining anti-trafficking laws? Because we have those and they're there for a reason, but they need to work with the industry, not against them.
What would acknowledging this continuum of exploitive practices mean for corporate actors, for example? So you talk a lot about how, again, it's this sort of, it's seen as, modern slavery is seen as a contaminant. It's totally different from what other things that are going on in the economy. It's something perpetrated by outsiders and villains that don't have anything to do with corporate actors. So if they were to acknowledge this continuum of abusive practices, how would the approach to eliminating exploitation be different? And in particular, I'd love it if you could speak to unions in the way that corporate social responsibility statements and pamphlets speak or don't speak about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Unions.
That's one of my favorite kind of topics in a way, because it's so mind-blowingly stupid when you realize what it is that they're doing. The real answer, if we were taking a meaningful approach that actually wanted to address these problems, both the very extreme forms of exploitation and the lesser forms, would really be about kind of resilience and rights, right? Rather than raid and rescue, get the individual, resilience and rights on a systemic level. And that's now thankfully recognized by kind of really respected names in this field. So the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking has basically said that exact same thing. We need to address the general abuse in order to address the extreme. Practically, then, there are some really obvious things that we should be doing. So that includes labour inspection, right? So what we call labour market enforcement. Where are the people who are meant to be checking that minimum wage laws are obeyed? I don't know what it's like over there, but over here it's hilarious how much they don't really exist, how underfunded they are. One of our inspectorates that's for agency workers who are very high risk for being abused and exploited has 13 staff for 1.1 million workers, right? That's how many staff they've got to oversee a 1.1 million sector. So it's just completely impossible to actually observe, to make employers who might want to be a bit dodgy actually obey the laws, right? Related to that, of course, is that everyone needs to have those rights. And so that's where immigration policy creates enormous problems, because clearly lots of people don't actually have those rights that they should have. So we need to have labour rights be applicable to anyone regardless of their immigration status, because without that we just create pockets of our economy where this can thrive, and not only pockets of our economy where it can thrive, but we incentivize structures, so like supply chain structures where there's more outsourcing and things like that, and then that starts to look natural, but it's actually a constructed thing, right, to try to get the cheapest labour possible, which often means abused labour. Related to that, and this does exist in some jurisdictions in the world, we could limit the number of tiers you can have in a supply chain. We could do that, and it does exist in some places. We could limit how much outsourcing you can have. So, for example, nowadays, construction companies will often not have any actual construction staff, like employees. It will all be agency work, and there's a reason for that. It's cheaper, and they can essentially get away with dealing with abuse, basically, and have legal distance from it. Unions and other forms of kind of collective worker organisation are absolutely key. And I explain in the book one of the most kind of maddening things about working in this space is being at meetings and roundtables and things like that with large corporations who really want to solve modern slavery, right? They really want to, and they'll sit there kind of asking how on earth they can find out how the workers in their supply chains are feeling about their conditions, and they'll scratch their heads, and someone will mention a new app that might be the solution, right? Totally. And it'll go on like that, and nobody will suggest trade unions, even though obviously unions are the first and foremost way of kind of having a litmus test of what's actually going on the shop floor, of having a channel for people to communicate concerns and to make sure their rights are upheld. That is what they're for. When I've raised it in those kinds of modern slavery contexts, I'm always told, well, this is outside the bounds of modern slavery, because modern slavery is this exceptional contaminant that's like nothing we've seen before and isn't about the general continuum, as we've discussed. So it's really interesting that that is kind of left out of the picture, and it needs to be brought back in. I think it's a problem of unions as well. They've allowed modern slavery to like take the turf away from them, basically. The other thing I'd just mention, because it is a massive US success story on this, is the concept of worker-driven social responsibility. There's something called the Fair Food Program for the tomato industry that is incredible, because your agricultural laborers don't have the same rights to unionize as a hangover of slavery in the US. They've had to take a different approach, and it's just really worth looking into, because it's got rid of trafficking, sexual harassment in the tomato fields, it's got people better wages, and it's done it through grassroots kind of collectivizing and campaigning, and then going to the brands that are buying the tomatoes and essentially freaking them out on a reputational level. And it's very clever, and it's now being transferred to lots of other sectors around the world.
You know, a similar kind of law and order misframing, you know, it definitely happens with actual just plain old police law enforcement. You know, we're here doing something, they're there doing something else. And in America, one of the most interesting things that the alliance kind of between the police and Hollywood was incredibly interesting in sort of moving that framing along, in which they were feeding Hollywood storylines and give them access to police cars, you know, kind of writing this. How do you feel like the culture, like, you know, mainstream culture, Hollywood films, you know, television, how are companies sort of diving in to make sure that this frame gets solidified on the tube?
Yeah. So the media is basically massively culpable for what's happening, and some of that is corporate funded. So you will see corporate funded advertising, or kind of like multi-week campaigns in major newspapers or on major websites that have corporate funding behind them on this topic. And the language, as I talk about a bit in the book, the language that you'll see is exactly in this blockbuster thing. The answer is law enforcement. Yeah, and it's all very much in this, everything is individualized, right? It's an individual instance of violence rather than a structural problem, or it's because of that bad apple rather than the rotten barrel, as we've said. And I think there are lots of parallels, actually, with lots of things. So a few years ago, I remember learning that there'd been a few attempts at class lawsuits in the US against fast food companies for people ending up with obesity and diseases as a result of eating a lot of their food. And they were called the Personal Responsibility Consumption Acts that people were trying to pass. Which I just found, I enjoy American legislation names, because they always say like the actual thing, and we don't really do it in that way here. But yeah, it really surprised me at the time, because it was so kind of blunt and obvious that it was like, you know, it's a political choice to be like, we're not going to come down on these companies that are choosing to advertise to your kids and putting all these ingredients in things, but we're going to make you responsible for it. And I think it's very, very comparable to that in a way, and it's kind of, in general, it's the neoliberal approach, isn't it, really?
Yeah, to draw another major parallel to the US, I think one thing that was super frustrating for us on the left over the last 4 or 5 years was this conception of President Trump as this aberration rather than a continuation of the Republican Party policies. So that was something that we saw across every single political topic. You know, Trump was cast continually as something that was separate from, different from, and totally not related to what came before him. And I actually want to relate this back to abuse in the supply chain, because there was a big expose in the Washington Post about Ivanka Trump's garment manufacturing companies. So there's this whole expose, and it was like, Ivanka Trump is abusing workers. Like, she personally is abusing workers, because if you go into this supply chain, you're going to find all of these garment manufacturers that are abusing people. At the same time, the Washington Post has been a big water carrier for international trade deals with a complete lack of oversight in factories like these. So rather than framing it as we have a lack of oversight into how our garments are made generally, or even drawing that connection between Ivanka Trump and other corporate actors, they cast Ivanka Trump as the sole villain outside of a structure that promotes this behavior. And they even went so far as in the article to say, you know, just very generically, like at a time when other manufacturers have moved away from these practices, which isn't true at all. So really, the exact same dynamic you're talking about, which is picking a specific villain to avoid dealing with the structural issue. And I did also want to ask about, you know, personal responsibility, that side of it that you were speaking about. I thought it was really funny that you talked about how they did a study. Someone did a study, you can speak to the details, about what people know about modern slavery. And the whole report basically said, you know, like the public is so misinformed and they're so wrong. And actually everything the public intuitively knew was actually pretty correct. Like they were like, I don't think it's something I can choose to change through my shopping habits, because it's really these corporate actors that are committing these crimes. And also, like, I don't want to report someone because I'm afraid they're going to get deported. Like, it doesn't seem like a good idea. And the whole report basically said, like, oh, we need to re-educate these people. So can you speak a little bit more to that study and their findings and their analysis versus you know, your feelings about it?
So we've had this massive push here, and I know that it's common in lots of countries around the world, actually, that consumers are the answer to modern slavery, to solving modern slavery. If we just shop right, then everything will be okay, and, you know, we can feel like good capitalist citizens. And it's definitely kind of one of the main themes we have, and there's all sorts of apps developed to help us do that, or to report if we think we've seen someone on our high street who might be a victim. And so there were a group of academics who did some research to try to understand, well, what do consumers actually know about this modern slavery thing? Do they know what it means? How do they interrelate with the topic? And what, therefore, does that mean we need to do to get consumers to be better able to engage with it? So you're already starting from a premise that assumes that consumers are a huge part of the answer, which I don't think they are. But it was very interesting reading their results, because, as you say, the public that were part of this research weren't sure where the threshold was between kind of labour abuse, so like you're not being paid the minimum wage or whatever, and modern slavery, like what actually is so bad that you can call it modern slavery. And the conclusion was that there needs to be more education. Well, in reality, if you understand the range of legal terms that are housed by this phrase, modern slavery, you would know that there isn't a clear threshold, and that you can have circumstances that don't actually seem that extreme that can fit into trafficking. So, you know, if someone's been recruited and they've been told they're going to be paid £100 a day, and then they're being paid £40 a day, that would actually potentially fit a trafficking definition, because they're being recruited under fraudulent claims and then they're being exploited because it's less than the minimum wage. Everything else could be fine for them, and they could be happy with their situation, which is actually something we see when police try to police trafficking here, is that some people are like, could you go away, please, because this is my best job option available. So the public were right. Like, judges aren't sure of the threshold. Lawyers aren't sure of the threshold. Obviously, you get cases that are really obvious, but that's the exception. They also were very clear that they didn't feel that they were personally responsible for it, and that they felt this was really an issue for companies or the state to do something about. Now, of course, it would be nice to live in a world where everyone has the income and the time to do research, to shop ethically, though whether or not that's actually feasible with the supply chains of all of the things, you know, it's not, unless you know someone down the road with a sheep and you're getting your jumper knitted by that wool, you're not going to be able to do it anyway. So, you know, they were right. It's not really their responsibility, and it is this structural thing. If we changed our immigration policy so we stopped making people criminals because they don't have the right paperwork, we would radically reduce the amount of exploitation in the UK. That's got nothing to do with where we're shopping. They also, something that was, again, kind of funny in this research, that in the UK, comparable to the California law, where which requires companies to make these disclosures about what they're doing to tackle trafficking in their supply chains, we have the same thing. We require large companies to make an annual disclosure saying what steps, if any, and that's an important 2 words, what steps, if any, they're taking to tackle trafficking in their supply chains. And so this bit of the law was very much touted by our Prime Minister at the time as being really crucial to the success of the UK in vanquishing modern slavery, because it meant consumers could understand whether the places they were shopping at were doing good things or not, because they could go and read these statements, right? Now, obviously, nobody does that because that's not how anybody shops. And as I say in the book, what are you going to look up? If you're in a supermarket, are you going to look up the supermarket or the brand of toothpaste you're in front of or the manufacturer of that toothpaste, etc., etc., etc.? So it's not really feasible. Nonetheless, these the public that were researched in this report said they don't really want to read long reports. They're not really going to do that, which obviously we could have all predicted. So the conclusion drawn was that we need to have shorter reports from companies, which just shows the utter kind of nonsensical situation we're in, because to what extent is someone random who doesn't work on this going to know if they read like Apple's little half paragraph about what they're doing to tackle trafficking and exploitation in their supply chain? How are they going to know if they're actually doing it, if what they're saying is meaningful, etc., etc.? So the whole thing becomes this smoke and mirrors, this attempt to make the consumer responsible when it's just completely infeasible, and it's definitely a deflection from the government having to do something.
Right. So basically anything except empowering workers and making it safe for them to talk to authorities or talk to whoever about the fact that they're being exploited. So we have these large groups, migrants, sex workers, people in corporate supply chains, who all are being exploited in the informal economy and have no pathway out of exploitation. And then we have corporate actors who, as you said, are really putting on a show for the government to avoid the government stepping in and regulating them. I'd be interested, before we go, just to drill down on a couple more things. You talked about corporate social responsibility and these business audits. So this is like another prong of another tool that corporate actors use to sort of stave off government regulation. So what are these audits? So audits, how do they operate and why are they ineffective?
Checks on supply chains, basically. So someone will go along periodically with a clipboard and a checklist, and they will work out what's going on. They might ask to look at some paperwork. If they're doing their job better than some, then they might interview workers off the site, though often they won't. They'll only talk to the workers that the management suggests they talk to, and they may not talk to workers at all, right? So audits are basically a mechanism by which a company hires another company to go in and check and confirm that everything is fine, right, in their supply chain. And I phrase it in that way deliberately. And in addition, this idea of modern slavery being so extreme, what you'll find is auditors are often only looking for very extreme things for them to report as potential cases. So they will report potential cases, but only if they present in this like insanely extreme way, which isn't actually what the definitions are. The thing about audits that's important, really, because they obviously sound very boring, but the thing that makes them interesting is that they are a signifier of power dynamics, right? It is the company operating upon the worker. So the assumption there is that the workforce have nothing to say for themselves. The workforce shouldn't be the ones who are saying, hey, this isn't okay, hey, that's not okay. Instead, it should be a corporate person that's paid, comes in, observes and leaves on one day, rather than the workers being listened to and being allowed to organise in a way that makes them be the frontline defenders of their rights every single day. So that would be things like unions. And that's the power problem that we have at play. And that's the entire way that the corporate anti-slavery model works. It's to pretend the workforce are essentially like amorphous liquid that we just need to occasionally pick out a problem from, but we shouldn't be kind of listening to in any way.
Right, and this goes back to that same sort of like victim rescue narrative, similarly with migrants and sex workers, rather than having migrants speaking about their experience or sex workers speaking about, what would actually be helpful for sex workers. We have these charities and, NGOs, organizations that are not run by sex workers that are sort of voluntarily saying, okay, well, here's what we think is good for sex workers. So I guess if you could just leave us with something, maybe speak a little bit to, in terms of reform in all of these areas, what do advocates and what do people want to see to make all of these environments safer for workers?
Yeah, so I think the very obvious thing, and unfortunately true in so many countries around the world, is to end the criminalization of people because of their immigration status, so that everybody has the same rights, and to make sure that people can try to travel to safety across the world without becoming illegal. Refugees cannot get to places without being deemed illegal, and that makes no sense as a process. So without doubt, that's absolutely essential, and nobody can pretend to actually care about modern slavery issues unless that's one of their demands. With the sex industry, we absolutely have to decriminalize the sex industry, because the best way to create a thriving pool of trafficking is to take away people's rights. And obviously people in the sex industry don't have rights when they're criminalized, and doubly so if they're also migrants without the right paperwork. So we have to decriminalize the sex industry, and at the same time have an anti-trafficking strategy within it, just like we need to have in farming, construction, and everything else, right? And then with corporations, it's exactly as we've discussed. It's about stopping this being a conversation about consumers and making it into a conversation about business models, about structures, and being really deliberate about that, and refusing to play this game where we can shop our way out of exploitation, because we can't.
Emily, thank you so much. And Julia, thank you so much for putting this together. I think you lay out the argument just so clearly. It's just really helpful to hear it in such a coherent, cogent way.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. And to all our viewers, definitely check out Emily's book, The Truth About Modern Slavery.
La imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida, sacrificarse hasta la muerte.
I mean, so it's not a big deal, and it's already a conversation that maybe you've had with other people. And I guess maybe it is a big deal because I am the host. But what I'm saying is, when we do our 60-second things, and it's a new segment, I feel like I'm obeying the spirit of it by not preparing more than a few notes and just diving in and seeing what happens. Whoa, like Evel Knievel might not make it. If he was gonna make it, then it's not even interesting.
That's what makes it special,
right? Like, yeah. The idea that somebody's gonna really hurt themselves out there trying to do one of these 60 seconds things, I think it's good, and that's why I feel like both Julia and Forrest writing theirs down. It's not something that I would complain to them about personally, because I understand they're under a lot of pressure, a lot of stress, and they don't want to get it wrong, and the people with the comments, you get these things wrong,
Mm-hmm.
You forget when the doctrine is, people are angry. So I don't know what to do. So I was appreciating it I would appreciate it if you could talk to them and say that you thought that it was unfair and that you think it would be more fair to level the playing field. And I think I would use that term, the level playing field, to keep it level, that we should all improvise, and this is where I want you to think about it because I don't know exactly how to do it, or that we should all just write it down, but I don't want to actually have to write it down, so don't do that.
That could be a teleprompter, or with someone with signs. Nah.
Hi, welcome back to the committee program. I am your host, Arun Chaudhary, and I'm very excited about this next segment. When I was in Rome, I got a chance to catch up with some folks who were doing some really interesting campaigning and cracking the code on something very important. And so without any further ado, I would like to introduce Fulvio Venanzetti, who is working in digital and social media and communications for the Pensioners Union. Actually, why don't I let you explain exactly what your job is after, and I do this to everyone. Sorry, Fulvio. These really long introductions on things. I say what you've cracked the code on, which is, if Italy makes one thing other than amazing food, it is lots and lots and lots of old people, right? The population difference is the biggest in the world, I think, other than Japan, definitely the biggest in Europe. And so actually cracking the code on how the youth and old can, work together culturally and vote together is something that is interesting all over the place, but especially in Italy. Can you just tell us first a little bit about your job and why cracking that code was your job?
Yeah, well, at first, thanks for having me. It's kind of nice. And, well, how can I say it? Yes, me and Lorenzo that you have met, work for the Pensioners Union, which is part of CGIL, which probably the audience doesn't know that good, but it's the biggest union in Italy.
It's a very big, very powerful, very important union. The equivalent would be if the AFL-CIO was bigger and stronger and mattered more.
Yeah, but I don't know. We're 60 millions. You are 300 millions, I guess, a bit more. And yeah, we have 2.5 million members in the SPI, il Sindacato Pensionati Italiani, and we kind of think that is a great opportunity. I mean, some people may find for a union to be a weakness because we're representing people that don't work anymore. But we think that it's a great opportunity because it's a reflection of our society. As you said, we are the oldest country in Europe, the second in the world after Japan. And we work in the communication, in the social media. We kind of try to build strategies to connect more the people that we represent with the world we're living now. And we try to do by innovate a little bit. What is that about cracking the code? I mean, making the pensioners, the old people, able to understand what they see, because we've seen the explosions of social media. Now you have TikToks that it's going crazy. They probably don't understand it that good, but they feel like Facebook was the thing for them because it's kind of easy, and we have seen an exponential growth in the use of social media by retired people, by old people in the last few years, and also the COVID pandemic did great.
I was going to say, yeah, just steroids for that, right?
Yeah, because they felt the need to be in connection with their children, with their nephews, with the rest of the world, actually. So they started using Zoom, they started using anything you can imagine. And they actually reacted good. I mean, they're able to do it. It's nothing new for them. So that was a surprise. And by asking us how could we understand better what they feel, we started to do some research, and we wanted to try to tell the world, the people who see us, who watch us, what their world is alike, what the old people world is, because also a problem is that they're often treated by public opinion, and also young people like they're at the margin right now. They are not needed. They don't produce. They don't work. So it's almost like they are some sort of, I'm missing the word, I guess.
Well, disposable to society, like sort of been put aside, I guess. Which is sort of why the kind of lowest common denominator culture that's aimed at them, which is like, sort of bad news television about like local crime and stuff, is
but there
it is so sort of horrible because, I mean, look, you guys have made this book, and we will put a link because it's now available for folks to get it, where you show a lot of the work that you've done. And some of it, is, surprisingly, meme-heavy stuff. So, you're talking about grandparents wanting to talk to their kids. Yeah, that's one thing. But when you are like, we want to do something that's internet funny, like, how does that conversation start, I guess?
Well, the point is, we started using memes in our main strategy in communication because we saw that old people actually reacted to that very, very good. The point is, we can't do a meme that it's, I don't know, pointless in a way, just funny. We need to put content inside that.
And the message has to be in there, yeah.
The political message needs to be there, and visually and from the point of view of the content, it needs to fit in what we do. I mean, our members need to see that and say, yeah, it's a bit strange, but it's something I can relate to. And over the years, we started collecting, just for fun, me and Lorenzo, screenshots or screen caps of the comments that we received, the images they sent us, the memes we did. And at some point, we thought, well, this thing might be worth something, because it's like a window on a world that nobody really looks up to, because getting old, it's not that great. And a source of inspiration also was Aging in America from Ed Kashi, which is a book of, I don't know, many years ago. If I don't remember bad, it's like around 2003,
yeah, I think it's,
maybe, something like that.
Yeah, in the very early 2000s.
And he tried to, he succeeded in telling a story about old people in America by pictures. So we made this Ciao Nonna, this book that you showed, and it's great even to see it behind a monitor. And we tried.
And that means hello, grandma. I'm in between Italian teachers right now, but I'm still showing off. The residual. It's really stuck.
And the result was I don't know. We think good. The book had. Oh wow! We have a cat.
That's Golda.
Great cat, by the way.
The studio cat.
The Ciao Nonna had two missions, if we can call them like that. First one was to try to tell the world of the unions to the younger generations, because they don't know us anymore. They don't want to know us. They kind of think that we are old-fashioned. We don't really understand what's going on, but we try to do our best to stay in the present. And to do that, we needed to use a more fresh language, something that they could relate to. The second mission was to try to build relationships with the cultural world, with people that usually we don't speak to. You, for example, we had the chance to meet you because we had this book, and it was great. I mean, and we partially succeeded in that. The fact that right now the book is going to, we started it by printing it in a limited edition. We had, I don't know, in our minds, this book would have never sold a copy. But we were surprised because actually people started liking it. People started to ask us if we could talk about it, if we can go around and, I don't know, show it, sell it.
You need to turn sometimes the ideas into an object. I would remind you of the UK 2017 general election when they had the manifesto, when it was so exciting. It was just like sometimes when you have the object,
it can help to build the myth.
So, I mean, I think you make a good point that, we underestimate old people. And so, their understanding of humor that's necessary to get young people in is very similar. And so this cuts both ways. But I want to ask you about the other ingredient, which is nostalgia. So, I think we know how effective nostalgia is for the people who have lived through it. I mean, that's very obvious. How have you used nostalgia to also get young people interested, and how do they react differently to things that you do that are sort of more purely nostalgic?
Well, we usually get two kind of reactions from young people. You have to know that sometimes young people and old people, the mass media, they try to make them conflict. I hope this is good in English. So they basically say that old people stole their futures. It's kind of messed up. But also with the pandemic, something changed because, as you could have seen, young people had to stay home to save old people that were at risk of dying, and they did it good because they're their grandparents, uncles, parents, whatever. So they need to be protected. The nostalgia. Well, I'd like to say something before about nostalgia. We also have to get that old people are changing. The old people that we represent now are not the old people we are used to think about. Their past, it's not the Second World War. It's the 70s.
Right, it's not this sort of permanent post-war generation
Exactly.
who we always sort of, that just old people to us.
Yeah, we were used to think about our grandparents that, they've seen Hitler, they've seen Stalin or whatever, but it's, right now, they're completely different people. Their values come from the great fights for civil rights, divorce, abortion, the workers' laws, and all that. And that is a thing that young people, it's a portion of history that young people, at least in our country, don't know. They don't know anything about it because in our school programs, you just stop studying after World War II.
This is exactly like the U.S. If you're lucky, you finish World War II. They have to yell out your way out the door. You're like, "Oh, U.S. won!" And everyone's like, "All right."
And then that's it. But the world, in the 19th century, has been something great. You had a lot of fights, a lot of things happens. The Berlin Wall, whatever, and they don't know anything about it. So when we started to make memes, to innovate a bit our communication, we tried to make contents that activated that frame of the 70s for our members, and the young people reacted quite good because it was something that they had never seen. So the nostalgia, it's a bit in the loving frame, so it's my grandpa, my grandma. I want to connect better. The grandparents want to connect better with their nephews or children or whatever you want. And another frame, it's this one. It's about who they really are, what they did. Our civil rights are, in a way, we got them because of our grandparents, and that is something that we should know and recognize. Another thing that I guess made the book a bit successful, it's also that inside there is something that activates fear inside the young people, because we also tried, but this is it's years now that we try to do something about that, but we also try to explain how hard can be to get old. Life now, it's longer. We live longer, but how do we live? How well do we reach our final years? I think also about COVID in the last months, how many times have we heard the fact that the people dying, they had other pathologies or whatever, two or more pathologies that led to their end, sadly. And the fact is, who takes care of old people when they're old and they're not self-sufficient anymore? We do. It's their children, it's their grandchildren, and sometimes they have to pay. I mean, it's hard to compare our health system because it's very different.
Incomparable.
And
yeah.
I don't want to maybe, and I don't have the skills of the knowledge or the knowledge to talk about it properly. But that thing also was something that we felt was of great interest for the youngsters that got the book, and also, of course, the appearance of it, because it's red and it has this thing which makes a bit clear on which side.
Yeah, the pixelated hammer and sickle, just to make sure people are seeing. And I think it's so right that it's nostalgia aimed at people who are old now, not some sort of bullshit like Steven Spielberg, Greatest Generation kind of like feature film. And it's sort of taking the same way that often middle-aged, political consultants, I'll throw myself in, sort of paint the youth with a brush. And it's like, oh, they really care about the environment more than anything else, and student loans because they all are like, care about the planet and their education. And it's like they care about the same stuff that you care about. And like, as you're pointing out, one of the things that they care about is who the hell is going to take care of me when I get old? Do we have enough of a welfare state? Will there be enough left? Or will like Lega sell it to the Republicans in the U.S. or something?
Well, if something doesn't change, it's going to be hard. I mean, right now in Italy we are able to withstand the public health, the expenses for the public health, because people worked with good contracts and everything. But the new generations, they're not working with full-time jobs.
It's precarious work. It's precarious work. It's gray area stuff. Yeah.
And if things continue to go like this, it's kind of scary, because we're not going to have enough money to sustain all of us that are going to live a lot. And maybe, I don't want to scare you, but it's a problem. It's a problem. It's something that we need to look up to and try to solve it. And
well, when you are solving problems, I mean, yes, this is huge, huge and seemingly intractable thing, but you do represent a lot of people in Italy. So how are you in the pensioners union, as a big gorilla in the room, able to exercise power on the political debate? And how does your digital communication strategy play into that?
All right. Well, it's kind of hard, because we try to talk with the governments that have succeeded over the years. Some of them were a bit more receptive. Others, a bit less. We had like 7 years of total silence, and we were completely incapacitated. But yeah, we represent. We have 2.5 million members, but we actually talk for 1/3 of the population, because in Italy you have 16 million pensioners.
Got it.
Pensioners. If you think also about the over 60s people that still are not retired but are working, but anyhow they feel a bit like, I don't know, aging. We're representing more than 1/3. And the thing is that these people, the old people, are the only ones right now that are still participating in the democratic flow of the state. They vote, they go in demonstrations, they also spend.
They volunteer. I was always surprised to see the average age of a volunteer on a campaign for like a young, exciting campaign like that we would work on.
But they go to cinema.
It's probably like 65, 70 years old. Yeah.
They go to cinema, they go to theaters, they go to restaurants, they spend because they actually have money. Because the crisis, since they were already retired, didn't hit them that bad. So they kind of are a bit, I don't know, the ones that got
an easier time a bit.
Yeah. so they feel a bit safe in a way. And that portion of population is the one how can I say it? The parties, the political parties, they're much more interested in their votes than in the younger's vote, because the younger, they're not organized. They are, I don't know, a bit more cynic. They don't believe anymore in politics, whilst the old people do. So also because they, as I said before, they participated in the 70s and in the 80s in great battles for civil rights. Right now, they still want to participate. So we are able to interact with them, and by interacting with them and in getting their instances, I don't know if it's a word, if there are problems, we can transfer them to the public debate. Our communication strategy was to try to use more the instruments that we think work more. As I said, social medias right now, they're full of old people. They use internet. We also felt that it was kind of a waste of money. We also have to think about that in doing advertising on buses or metro stations or whatever, because what's the conversion in that? Instead, by studying the territory, if you allow me to use this word, and and try to say the right thing at the right moment with the right instrument, with a language that can be understood by the masses, also the young people, we forced a bit the governments to lend ears to our demands, and it's something that we succeeded 3 weeks ago when the PNRR was released, the recovery plan. It has like 10 names. When it was
gobs
released,
of money coming to recovery.
We saw that a law to take care in the next years, it needs to be written, but the basics for it to be written well, there are. I don't have the words. We had a lot. It's written inside the recovery plan that we're gonna have a law for the not self-sufficient old people that we have.
Yes. Okay. Yes. People who can't take care of themselves. Yeah. Invalids.
And that is partially also because of this. Because thanks to this, we had a chance to meet a portion of the government, and we had a chance to talk with them, and they were amazed by the book. I think we can say it. And thanks to this, that it worked like a Trojan horse to get inside. We presented these things, and we had the chance to put that inside the public debate. And we hope.
My last question for you is, and I think already the most important thing that I take sort of away is this idea of not taking history for granted and keeping up with it and sort of in the way that impacts people. But, this is in hindsight. As you were just sort of getting into your job and figuring it out, what was something that you really got wrong or were really surprised about, or an assumption you made that somebody really, let you know was the wrong way to think about this? I think this would be the most helpful thing for our comrades over in Europe and in North America, so that they can start activating their pensioner people.
Well, I think maybe the compromise, the ability to reach a compromise, to be patient, fight for what you think is right, but also to take it slow. You can do great steps in one day. You have to be part of a process, and our members, our old people that I have the chance to work with every day, they're all like that. They really believe in what they're doing, and they have also the time to do it because they're free. They don't have to work every day, all day. And that's probably the thing that I would like to pass the most to young people, to I don't know, to the people that will see this, and the thing that I've learned the most. So to reach a compromise with what you do, with what you want to do, and to take step by step, little steps to reach.
Yeah,
your
you got to
goal.
take a different rhythm, right?
Yeah.
It's not about winning,
but
this hour or getting that email out right away where you
Yeah.
make the perfect argument.
But
It's
they
about
succeeded
like
with a
let them
lot
have the weekend
less.
to think about it.
With a lot less instruments that we have, so I think that we can do it much better if we want to. That's the thing.
Fulvio, thank you so much for coming on.
Well,
really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we'll have to have you back on maybe closer to the elections. You can tell us how the old person vote's going to go and all this kind of thing. You can be let us know.
Yeah, well, but I'd be honored, but we'll see. I don't know. I guess that we'll have to make some polls between our members. They're strange, but we'll see.
Yeah, no, I know. It's a real struggle in the States, too.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll talk soon.
Thanks a lot.
Comité, comitato, comitiet, comiteto, carul, comité.
So if you're hearing it from them, it's because I did tell them that I find, I want there to be, I think I used the term level playing field. And, I think spontaneity should trump the kind of written word on this. And I just think it's not fair. It kind of makes me look like maybe I don't know what's going on,
That's a total lie. I didn't write down anything.
The Peru thing.
That's not true.
You did not write that down. You were not reading it.
No. I wasn't reading it because we did 15 takes.
Well, I thought you were
and
having
it
a
was
hard
different
time
every
reading
time.
it.
It was completely different every time. The first 5 times I was talking about her dad being in jail, and then I cut all of that.
Okay. It sounds like I owe you an apology. It sounds like that.
I think
and I want to be known as a person who is, who easily can do that. But I will say I really did. Yeah, well, I'd like to be known as a person who's good at that thing you mentioned. But what I think, I even still now am having a hard time not believing that. It seemed very much like you were reading, but we accept.
I'm just smarter
I take
than
you at your word, as Hillary Clinton did Barack Obama when he said that he wasn't a Muslim.
Comité, comitato, comitiet, comiteto.
Hi, I'm so glad you're still with us, and thanks for watching the show tonight. As you can see, exciting news around Committee HQ here in Berlin. We have the equipment. The equipment is here. Hopefully you will start to see more of it as we put together the studio, which will be in the room right next to here. And maybe we can even start having guests into the studio. That will be bananas. But one thing we will continue to do is to help you come down from the excitement of the show with our sleepy time readings. And tonight I was thinking a lot about the show and how I often save a lot of my praise and energy for Marx, who I think is not only a great thinker, but also just a beautiful writer. And sometimes you have to celebrate people who aren't as great, the pseudo-intellectuals, those of us who lag a little behind. I consider myself one of them. And I also consider Frederick Engels to be one. I'm going to be reading the bit of the introduction to his book on the origins of family, private property, the state. I may have gotten those in the wrong order. It's, of course, his classic book. And I think it's just a really good illustration of how sometimes he takes something that's even a sort of a footnote that he finds in Marx and runs with it very quickly and in one direction. And as I've said before, your college boyfriend who you didn't like, who was always spouting communist stuff, was more often than not talking about Engels and not Marx, because he's the one who just makes it a little too simple, a little too easy. But we love him. We love him in the way that I hope you love me as a pseudo-intellectual. There has to be room for the intellectuals and the pseudo-intellectuals. Anyway, I think the introduction to the book shows both the promise and success of being quick and direct about these kind of things, and also the pitfalls. From the introduction. The following chapters are, in a sense, the execution of a bequest. No less a man than Karl Marx had made it one of his future tasks to present the result of Morgan's researches, and he had written a book on ancient societies. He's an American. in the light of conclusions of his own, within certain limits, I may say, our materialistic examination of history, and thus to make clear the full significance. For Morgan, in his own way, had discovered afresh in America the materialistic conception of history discovered by Marx 40 years ago, and in his comparison of barbarism and civilization, it had led him in the main points to the same conclusions as Marx. And just as the professional economists in Germany were for years as busy plagiarizing capital as they were persisting in attempting to kill it by silence, so Morgan's ancient society received precisely the same treatment from the spokesman of prehistoric science in England. My work can only provide a slight substitute for what my dear departed no longer had the time to do. But I have the critical notes which he made to show his extensive extracts from Morgan, and as far as possible, I reproduce them here. According to the materialistic conception, the determining factor in history is, in the final instance, the production and reproduction of the immediate essentials of life. This again is of a twofold character. On the one side, the production means of existence, of articles of food, of clothing, dwelling, and of the tools necessary for that production. And on the other side, the production of human beings themselves, the propagation of the species. The social organization under which people of a particular historical epoch and a particular country live is determined by both kinds of production, by the staged development of labor on the one hand and of the family on the other. And let me editorialize for 1 second. Marx himself, of course, talks about people, individuals, art, literature, and I feel like that is what gets left out of the Engels quick trip. The lower the development of labor, and the more limited the amount of its products, and consequently the more limited also the wealth of society, the more the social order is found to be dominated by kinship groups. However, within the structure of society based on kinship groups, the productivity of labor increasingly develops, and with it private property and exchange, differences of wealth, the possibility of utilizing the power of labor over others, and hence the basis of class antagonisms, new social elements which in the course of generations strive to adapt the old social order to the new conditions, until at last their incompatibility brings about a complete upheaval. In the collision of the newly developed social classes, the old society founded on kinship groups is broken up in its appearance, a new society, with its control centered in the state, the subordinate units of which are no longer kinship associations, but local associations. A society in which a system of the family is completely dominated by the system of property, and in which there are now freely developed those class antagonisms and class struggles that have hitherto formed the content of all written history. It is Morgan's great merit that he has discovered and reconstructed in the main lines the prehistoric basis of our written history, and that in the kinship groups of North American Indians, he has found the key to the most important hitherto insoluble riddles of the earliest Greek, Roman, and German history. His book is not the work of a day. For nearly 40 years, he wrestled with his material until he was a complete master of it. But that also makes his books one of the few epic-making works of our time. So you do have to appreciate that Engels appreciates when people sit and stew with their material. But there has to be room for the people who do that. And there also has to be room for people like myself and Engels who stumble through everything a little too quickly and in our effort to give it to you. We'll keep going. Thanks so much. See you next time.